The call came on a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way, except that it wasn't. Clara was halfway through her second cup of coffee when her phone lit up on the kitchen counter, her brother's name across the screen. She let it ring twice before answering, something in her chest already bracing. He spoke quickly, the way he always did when delivering news that inconvenienced him personally. Their father had passed in the night. Quietly, the hospital said. No suffering, they said. Clara listened without interrupting, her hand wrapped around the mug, the warmth against her palm the only thing that felt real. She did not cry immediately. That was not how she processed things. She thanked her brother, ended the call, and stood at the counter for a long time, watching the steam rise from her coffee and dissipate into the kitchen air. Her father had been 73 years old. He had been sick for 2 years. She had known this moment was approaching the way you know winter is coming, not because you welcome it, but because the light begins to change and the air carries a different weight, and there is nothing you can do to slow any of it. She set the mug down and reached for her keys. The drive to her father's house took 40 minutes on a good day. She had made it dozens of times over the past 2 years, bringing food he would eat only half of, sitting with him in the workshop while he turned a stone over in his fingers, the way he had always turned stones, over in his fingers. Not anxiously, but contemplatively, the way a person handles something they have decided to trust. She knew every bend in the road, every field that opened up on either side of the highway, saw every landmark that told her she was close. She did not need to think about the route. She drove and let the distance shrink around her. When she arrived, her brother's car was already in the driveway. Her sister's was parked behind it at an angle that blocked the full width of the drive, the way her sister parked everywhere, as though space were a personal inconvenience designed to slow her down. Clara pulled onto the grass at the edge of the property and sat for a moment before getting out. The house looked the same as it always had, a modest 2-story on a half-acre lot at the edge of a small town, its paint a shade of gray that had faded from something more deliberate over the years. The garden along the front walk had gone partly wild, but not unpleasantly. Her father had stopped tending it when his hands began to trouble him. Nature had moved in with a quiet kind of courtesy, filling the spaces he left behind with self-seeded wildflowers and creeping grass that softened the beds without overwhelming them. Clara had always thought it suited the place. The workshop stood separate from the house, set back toward the far end of the property, behind a stand of oak trees that had grown too large for their location and cast a deep shade that nothing much grew beneath. It was a simple structure, wood-framed, single-story, with a wide sliding door that her father had kept oiled so it moved without effort. He had built it himself in his 40s, before Clara was born, when the house was new, and his ambitions about what he might do with his hands were still unchecked by the practical limits of time and money. He had told her that story more than once, and each time he had laughed at the younger version of himself, not unkindly, but with the fond exasperation of someone looking back at a person they no longer recognized, but still respected. Inside the house, her brother and sister were already in the living room. The atmosphere was not grief. It was the particular tension of people calculating something they had not yet spoken aloud. Her brother, David, stood near the fireplace with a coffee cup he had found in the kitchen, his posture carrying the restless certainty of a man who had already decided how things should go. Her sister, Margot, was seated on the edge of the couch in a way that suggested she had not come to sit, but to position herself, her handbag on her knee like a small declaration of readiness. They greeted Clara without warmth or coldness, and simply with the practiced neutrality of people who have shared a history too long and complicated to be reduced to any single emotion. There was brief talk about the hospital, about arrangements that would need to be made, about calls that had to go out to relatives their father had not spoken to in years, but who would nonetheless expect to be included. Clara listened, contributed where she was asked, and studied the room around her. She knew every object in it. The lamp on the side table that her father had rewired twice because he refused to replace it. The bookshelves that held a disorganized mix of reference texts on geology, mineralogy, and gemology, alongside paperback novels he had collected without particular system from second-hand shops. The framed photograph above the mantel taken 20 years earlier at a family gathering where everyone was laughing at something that had already been forgotten. Their father stood slightly apart from the cluster of relatives, not excluded, but observing, the way he had always stood in rooms full of people he loved, but did not fully belong to. It was Margot who brought it up first, because Margot always brought things up first when the things were financial. She said their father's estate would need to be reviewed, that the house and contents would need to be assessed, that there were debts to consider and assets to inventory. She said it the way she said most things, competently, and without room for interpretation. David agreed immediately, as he tended to agree with Margot when the subject was money, or their old rivalry suspended in the face of shared interest. He mentioned the workshop. He mentioned that their father had kept equipment in it, some of it potentially valuable. He mentioned a collection. Clara did not speak. She looked at the photograph above the mantel. The collection was something their father had built over a lifetime, not casually, not as a hobby in the way people took up gardening or woodworking when they retired, but with the focused, patient attention of someone for whom objects had meaning that went beyond their monetary value. He had worked for many years in the trade, not as a dealer or an appraiser in the formal sense, but as someone adjacent to it, a man who knew stones, who could describe the internal geometry of a sapphire the way other men described a game they had watched or a landscape they had passed through. He had acquired pieces over decades, some from estate sales, some from contacts who trusted his judgment, some from circumstances he had never fully explained. The collection was not large in volume, but her father had often said, in the careful way he said things he considered important, that volume and value were not the same measure. Her siblings did not remember him saying that. Or perhaps they remembered it and had simply decided to disagree. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and changed nothing between them in the way that conversations about inheritance rarely do, because the disagreements had always been there, resting beneath the surface like groundwater, waiting for pressure to find them. David wanted the house sold efficiently. Margot wanted the contents assessed and liquidated. There was talk of what their father's estate was worth and what their shares should be and how quickly the process could be completed. Clara said little. She had never been good at the kind of talking that moved money around, not because she lacked intelligence or conviction, but because she had learned early that in rooms where people were already decided, her voice carried the specific gravity of someone whose practicality was mistaken for agreement. When she finally spoke, she asked about the workshop. Margot glanced at her with the brief, calibrating look of someone trying to determine whether a question is strategic or innocent. David turned from the window. Clara said she would like to have the tool chest, her father's large metal tool chest, the one that had stood in the workshop as long as she could remember. She wasn't asking for the equipment, or the workbench, or whatever else the workshop contained, just the tool chest. There was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to reveal what her siblings thought of the request. David let out a short laugh, not cruel, but dismissive, the kind of sound that contained an entire assessment. He said, of course, that she was welcome to it, that it was an old thing and probably not worth the effort of moving. Margot said something about having the rest properly valued and turned back to the matter of the house, as though the subject had been closed. Clara nodded once. She said she would come back for it that weekend. She left shortly after, and stepping back through the front door and into the cooling afternoon. She walked to her car and stood beside it for a moment, looking back at the house, and then at the workshop beyond it, its sliding door closed, the oak trees casting shadows that shifted in the wind. She thought of her father standing at that door on a Sunday morning with his coffee, looking out over the yard with the unhurried expression of someone who had nowhere to be and considered that a privilege rather than a failure. She got into the car and drove home. Sleep came poorly that first week, not because of nightmares or grief that rose to the surface in uncontrolled ways, but because of the quiet. Clara lived alone and had done so for enough years that solitude was not uncomfortable to her. But the specific quality of the quiet that followed her father's death was different, denser, as though the air had been remixed with an ingredient she had not noticed until its absence. She would lie awake and think not of dramatic memories, the significant occasions and milestone events that people tended to reach for first, but of small ones. The way he held his coffee cup with both hands even in summer. The sound of him sliding a drawer closed in the workshop, unhurried, with exactly the right amount of force. She had spent more time in that workshop than either of her siblings had ever wanted to. David had found it dusty and dull from the time he was a boy. Margot had found the whole enterprise of their father's interest in stones impractical and slightly eccentric. Clara had found it simply interesting. She had sat on the stool near the secondary workbench from the time she was 7 or 8 years old, watching her father work under the lamp, asking questions he answered without condescension. He had taught her the vocabulary of it: clarity and cut, inclusion and facet. The way light behaved differently inside a stone, depending on what the stone was, and what had formed it, and how deep within the earth it had been when the conditions that created it were in place. He had shown her how to use a loupe, pressing it gently against her eye and guiding her hand until the interior of a small, uncut tourmaline resolved out of blur into something she could almost read. A world of planes and color that had existed inside a piece of mineral for longer than any human language. She had not pursued the subject professionally. Life had taken her other directions. She had worked in administrative roles for most of her adult life, competent and reliable in ways that were consistently undervalued, which she had accepted without bitterness as one of the standard costs of doing work that kept systems functioning without attracting notice. She was 41 years old and in reasonable health and had a small apartment she liked and a life that was not what she had imagined at 20, but was genuinely and without sentiment her own. What she had carried from those hours in her father's workshop was not expertise exactly, but attentiveness, a trained habit of looking closely at things before drawing conclusions, a tolerance for patience that other people found eccentric or slow. She returned for the tool chest on a Saturday, borrowing a truck from a neighbor she had helped move the previous spring. David was not at the house when she arrived. Margot was briefly, and helped not at all, but observed with the particular brand of composed neutrality that was her version of generosity when she had already gotten what she wanted. The workshop felt different with the intent of removal in it. Clara stood inside the sliding door for a moment before touching anything, letting the space settle around her. Her father's scent was in it still, faintly. Oil and stone dust, and the particular neutrality of a room where temperature and humidity were kept consistent by habit and design. The lamp above the main bench was off, but the afternoon light came through the small high windows in narrow bars that fell across the workbench and the shelves and the tool chest at the far wall. It was a large chest, the kind that had been built for professional use rather than weekend maintenance. Heavy-gauge steel, painted dark green at some point in its history, though the paint had worn to silver at the corners and along the drawer faces where hands had opened and closed them thousands of times. It stood on lockable casters, its body deep and wide, its upper cabinet rising to chest height. It wasn't elegant. It was not the kind of object people chose for display. It was the kind of object that had been chosen entirely for function and had justified that choice over decades. Clara ran her hand along the top. The metal was cool and slightly rough where the paint had oxidized. She opened the upper cabinet first, out of habit, the way she always had when she was a child, and her father sent her to retrieve something specific. The interior was organized the way her father organized everything, by logic that was not immediately apparent to an outsider, but revealed itself once you understood the system. The tools nearest the front were the ones used most often. The specialty instruments were arranged by function rather than by size. Small labeled trays held fittings and gauges and items whose purpose Clara could name even now, because she had asked enough times. She worked methodically, cataloging the contents before moving anything, the same approach she applied to most tasks. Her father had kept the chest well. The tools were clean, unoiled where oil was needed, wrapped in cloth where cloth was warranted. Several of the items were old enough to be considered antique by any reasonable standard, though her father had used them because they worked and had never been interested in the category of antique for its own sake. It took her an hour to fully document the upper section. She photographed each layer before removing it, an instinct she could not entirely explain beyond the generalized awareness that documentation was its own form of protection. When she reached the bottom drawer of the lower cabinet, she paused. The drawer was deeper than the ones above it, which was standard for a chest of this design. She pulled it fully open and looked at its contents. More tools, carefully arranged, a selection of measuring instruments, a roll of buffing cloth, a small wooden box she recognized as containing replacement parts for a particular piece of equipment her father had used for decades, despite better options existing. She removed each item and set it aside. When the drawer was empty, she crouched and looked at the drawer base. This was the kind of habit she had not consciously developed so much as absorbed. Her father had always looked at the base of things, the underside of shelves, the bottom of boxes. He had said once, when she was perhaps 10 years old, and had asked him why, that things were often better understood from the bottom up than the other way around. The drawer base appeared unremarkable. Metal, the same gauge as the chest walls, painted the same dark green that had long since oxidized to something more complex. But as Clara's eyes adjusted, she noticed something that required a second look. The base sat at a slightly different level than it should have, not dramatically, not the kind of difference that would announce itself, but enough that the proportion of the drawer's interior depth against the exterior height of the lower cabinet did not fully account for itself. She pressed against the base with both palms. It held firm. She pressed again, more deliberately, at each corner in turn. The third corner, the one at the back right, gave the faintest sensation of yield, not movement exactly, but compliance, a suggestion of a mechanism beneath the surface. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the chest for a long moment. She was not the kind of person who leapt to conclusions. She had seen false bottoms in old furniture before, or usually shallow compartments built for documents or small valuables, the kind of thing that had been fashionable at certain points in furniture making and then fallen out of practice. The sensation she had felt might have been nothing more than the slight give of metal under age and pressure. It might have been a loose fastening. It might have been the particular way her hands had distributed weight across a surface that was never perfectly level. She stood and walked once around the chest, looking at it from each angle with the same attentive patience she had learned as a girl, on a stool, watching a stone resolve out of blur beneath a loupe. The exterior dimensions of the lower cabinet did not match the interior dimensions she had measured with her eye. The discrepancy was small, but it was consistent. She would not force it today, and that was not how she operated. Forcing things before understanding them was how good objects were damaged and careful observations were lost. She had what she needed for now, the awareness that something was worth looking at more closely. That was enough. She loaded the chest onto the truck with help from the neighbor she had called, a quiet man named Pete, who asked no questions about why she was moving an industrial tool chest into her garage with the particular care usually reserved for something irreplaceable. He helped because she had asked, and that was sufficient reason. Once it was settled in her garage, blocked and secured so it would not shift, Clara stood in the doorway and looked at it under the garage's overhead light. The green paint looked different here than it had in her father's workshop, more worn, perhaps, or simply more visible, the way anything looked different once it had been moved from its context into a new one. She made a decision that same evening that she would approach this the way her father had approached everything worth approaching, without rush, with the full use of what she already knew, which was not everything, but was not nothing. She went inside and made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table with the specific quietness of a person who has decided to think rather than act, who understands that these are not the same thing, and that the second rarely improves upon the first when the first has not been fully completed. Over the following week, Clara spent her evenings in the garage. She worked methodically, the way she always worked when she was being careful. And she was being careful because she did not know yet what she was being careful about. That distinction mattered to her. Caution without knowledge of what you were protecting could harden into paralysis. But caution grounded in genuine attention was something else. It was preparation. She re-examined the exterior of the chest on the second evening, measuring its visible dimensions with a tape measure and recording them in a small notebook she had picked up from the kitchen drawer. The notebook had been her father's. It still had his handwriting on the first 3 pages, lists of numbers and material descriptions she recognized as inventory notes from a purchase he had made 2 years earlier. She had started a new page after his last entry without ceremony. The continuity felt appropriate. The measurements confirmed what her eye had registered. The lower cabinet's exterior height from base to lower drawer top was 4 inches greater than the interior space she could account for. 4 inches was not accidental. 4 inches in a piece of industrial equipment of this size and weight was a deliberate dimension. It had to accommodate something. On the third evening, she removed the lowest drawer entirely, lifting it free of its runners and setting it on the garage floor. With the drawer out, she could see the interior back wall of the cabinet more clearly, and the relationship between the bottom of the drawer opening and the base of the chest body. There was a gap, sealed cleanly, its edges flush with the interior walls, but a gap nonetheless. What she had taken for the cabinet floor was a shelf, not a base. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Her father had built this chest into his workshop before she was born. She had watched him use it for decades. She had stood next to it and retrieved tools from it, and never once questioned what the bottom drawer held beyond tools. The idea that there was a space beneath that drawer, sealed and flush and indistinguishable from construction, sat inside her with a weight that was not quite excitement and not quite fear, but something between them that she had no single word for. On the fourth evening, she found the mechanism. She had been looking for it since the first night, systematically eliminating possibilities with the same quiet thoroughness. The release was not at the corners, as she had initially thought. It was along the back interior wall of the drawer opening, at a point that would have been covered by the drawer when it was in place. A small raised section of metal, perhaps the size of a fingertip, textured to blend with the surrounding surface, but perceptibly different to a searching hand. She pressed it. There was a sound that she would later struggle to describe accurately. Not a click, exactly. More the sound of a seal releasing, a brief exhalation of equalized air. The false floor tilted a fraction of an inch on one side. Clara sat back. Her pulse was steady, but more present than usual. She had the sudden, irrational desire to call her father, not to tell him what she had found, but to ask him a question she did not yet know how to form. She did not open it that night. She covered the chest with a tarp and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, looking at the measurements she had recorded without writing anything new. She thought about her siblings. She thought about the way David had laughed and the way Margot had looked at her request as though it were a calculation she had already completed and found negligible. She thought about the hour she had spent in the workshop the afternoon she came to retrieve the chest, standing in the familiar space that now had a clock running in it. Every object either about to be assessed, sold, or removed. The lamp above the workbench that her father had stood beneath for 30 years. The shelves still holding the notebooks and reference texts he would never open again. The workbench itself, its surface scarred in patterns she knew the way she knew the lines of her own hands. She had taken the tool chest because it was the one object she could justify claiming without argument, because it was the one thing in that workshop that had been as much a part of her memory of her father as any photograph or word he had ever spoken. Not because it was valuable, because it was his, and because standing beside it as a small girl with a question in her mouth and patience enough to wait for the answer had been, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, where she had learned the most important things she knew. She had not expected to find anything inside it. That was the truth, and she held on to it carefully, because she was not someone who invented drama or inflated coincidence into meaning. She had taken the chest for the reasons she had identified. What she had found since was something else entirely, on something she had not manufactured and would not allow herself to exaggerate. On the 5th evening, she opened the false floor. The space beneath was shallow, no more than 3 inches deep, which accounted for the measured discrepancy and left no room for the dramatic. What it held was not gold or jewels or currency. It held a metal tray, the kind used to organize workshop drawers, slotted for items of specific dimensions, its slots empty of their original contents. And beneath the tray, fitted into the base of the hidden space with the same quiet intentionality that characterized everything her father had built or arranged, was an envelope. It was sealed, plain, not labeled, not addressed, not marked in any way that announced itself. The paper was thick, the kind her father had preferred for correspondence that mattered, and it was slightly discolored at the edges in a way that suggested age without suggesting damage. Clara lifted it carefully. It was lighter than its thickness suggested. She turned it over once in her hands. She did not open it immediately. She understood, in the way that she had come to understand a number of things over the past week, that some actions had a before and an after. That what she held in her hands existed right now on one side of a line, and that opening it would place her on the other side, permanently and without recourse. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it over dinner that she prepared and ate with the specific deliberateness of a person buying time, not out of reluctance, but out of respect for the gravity of a moment that deserved to be entered consciously rather than stumbled into. After she washed the dishes and dried them and put them away, she sat back down at the table and opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of the same paper, and beneath it, a smaller sealed envelope, its face marked in her father's handwriting with 2 words she had to read twice before they arranged themselves into full meaning. The smaller envelope said, "For the workshop." She unfolded the letter first. Her father's handwriting was as familiar to her as the sound of his voice, and seeing it in the kitchen, light with the house around her completely quiet, produced a sensation she had not prepared for. Not grief exactly, but the particular ache of presence recalled, the way a room can feel inhabited by someone who is no longer in it. She steadied herself and read. The letter was not long. He had never been a man of excessive words, and even here, in what she understood immediately to be a communication written with significant care, he used language economically. He wrote that he had watched his children over many years and had reached conclusions he had not shared, because he believed that certain conclusions were most honestly expressed through action rather than speech. He wrote that he had tried to prepare things as carefully as he could, given the limitations of time and his own imperfect judgment. He wrote that Clara had always understood what it meant to look at something until you actually saw it, and that he had believed for a long time that this quality, more than any other, was the one most required by what he had built. He wrote that the workshop held something he had not spoken of to anyone, that it had been kept there deliberately, prepared with care, and that the letter she was reading and the smaller envelope beneath it would provide what she needed to understand it fully. He wrote near the end, with a plainness that landed harder than any of the sentences before it. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you myself. I wanted to, but I kept thinking there would be more time, and then there wasn't." Clara folded the letter along its original creases and set it aside. She picked up the smaller envelope and held it without opening it, looking at his handwriting on its face. For the workshop. 2 words that contained, she was beginning to understand, considerably more than their literal meaning. Outside, the evening had settled into full dark. The garage door was closed. The street beyond the house was quiet, in the way streets went quiet at this hour, in a neighborhood where most people rose early and retired accordingly. Clara sat at the table under the kitchen light, with the small envelope in her hands, and felt the weight of the evening pressing around her, not heavily, not with dread, but with the particular gravity of a moment that had not yet shown its full shape. She opened it. Inside was a folded diagram, precise and hand-drawn on paper, that had been handled enough times to soften at the folds. She spread it flat on the table with both hands. It was a floor plan. Or rather, it was 2 overlaid floor plans, the workshop she knew drawn in light pencil, its proportions accurate and its details recognizable. The workbench and the shelves and the tool chest itself marked clearly in their positions. And beneath that, drawn in a darker hand over the first, a second plan that did not correspond to any surface structure she had ever seen. It showed the workshop floor as a ceiling. What lay below it was larger than the room above. There were measurements along each wall. There were notations she would need time to read carefully. There was a marked access point, indicated by a circle with a cross through it in the notation style she recognized from her father's other technical documents, positioned at a specific point on the workshop floor that she knew as the eastern corner, near the base of the secondary workbench, beneath the spot where her father had kept a strip of heavy rubber matting for as long as she could remember. Clara looked at the diagram for a long time without moving. The kitchen light hummed faintly above her. The house settled once, a small sound from somewhere in the walls, familiar and unremarkable. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car passed with its music briefly audible and then gone. She thought of the workshop. She thought of the rubber matting in the corner, the way it had always been slightly thicker than purely functional matting needed to be, slightly more permanent than an object kept for comfort alone. She thought of her father standing at the secondary workbench in the afternoon light, turning a stone over in his fingers, his back to the corner, unhurried and apparently absorbed. She thought of all the things that had been in plain sight. She folded the diagram carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the smaller envelope. She placed the smaller envelope alongside her father's letter and held both in her hands for a moment, sitting in the kitchen of her apartment with the weight of what she had understood descending slowly and without drama into the full reality of her body. Then she put both letters in the notebook between 2 of her father's pages and went to bed. She lay awake for a while, as she had been lying awake each night that week, but differently now. The quiet of the house was the same quiet it had always been. Her father was still gone. Those things had not changed. What had changed was the shape of what she was carrying into the days ahead, the sense that the story she had believed she was in, the ordinary story of grief and a modest inheritance, and siblings who measured everything in the same transactional currency, was not the full story, and had never been the full story. She thought of David's brief, dismissive laugh, of Margot's neutral, calibrating look, of the way both of them had returned, within 20 minutes of their father's death being confirmed, to the subject of the estate and its assets, and how quickly they might be resolved. She did not feel anger. That was not what rose in her. What rose was something quieter and more complicated, a recognition that her father had seen what she had always sensed without being able to name it, and that he had made a decision accordingly, carefully and in advance, and had trusted her with the result. The responsibility of that trust was the last thing she thought of, before sleep finally came. She returned to the workshop on the following Saturday, early, before the day had fully committed to its temperature. She had said nothing to either of her siblings about the letters or the diagram. She had said nothing to anyone. She was not certain yet that there was anything to say beyond what the diagram itself showed, and she would not speak before she understood. The house was empty when she arrived, the key under the back step where her father had kept it since she was a teenager. The air inside smelled the same as it had the last time, neutral and slightly cool, the particular temperature of a space recently vacated, rather than long abandoned. She walked through without lingering and came out through the back into the yard. The morning was gray and still, the kind of morning that promised neither drama nor disappointment, simply continuity. The oak trees at the back of the property were motionless. A bird moved in the grass near the fence without urgency. The workshop door slid open smoothly on its oiled track, the way it always had, the sound of it exactly as she remembered. Inside, everything was as she had left it on her previous visits. The shelves still held her father's reference books and notebooks. The workbench surface was clear of everything except its permanent scarring. The lamp above it was off. The secondary workbench, longer and lower, ran along the eastern wall beside the corner she had been thinking about since Thursday night. The rubber matting was in its place. Clara crouched beside it and ran her fingers along its edge. It was thick, industrial grade, the kind sold for standing mats in workshops and garages. She lifted the near edge and folded it back. Beneath was the concrete floor of the workshop, unremarkable at first glance, poured and smoothed and sealed with the same gray coat as the rest of the floor. But not the same, she saw immediately. Not quite. The section of floor in the corner beneath where the matting had lain was fractionally different in color. The difference was subtle enough to have been dismissed 100 times as variation in the concrete finish, the kind of inconsistency that appeared in any poured surface. But it was also, now that she was looking with the specific attention of someone who knew what they were looking for, the precise shape and dimension of a panel. She could see the seam. Once seen, it could not be unseen. A line no wider than a blade, running in a rectangle approximately 2 feet by 3, its edges dressed so cleanly into the surrounding floor that the gap between them was a matter of thousandths of an inch. Whatever had been used to finish the joint had been applied with patience and skill. Clara pressed her palms flat against the center of the panel. It was solid, unyielding. She moved her hands to each corner and pressed again, following the same logic she had used with the tool chest drawer, eliminating possibilities systematically. At the third corner, she felt the familiar suggestion of a mechanism, not movement, but potential. A point where the material responded differently to pressure than the concrete around it. She pressed. Nothing. She leaned closer and looked at the corner itself, the joint between the panel and the surrounding floor. In the seam, barely visible, was a point where the gap was fractionally wider than elsewhere. She produced the small steel probe from the toolkit she had brought with her and inserted it carefully. It slid in without resistance to a depth of perhaps an inch, then touched something that was not concrete. She increased the pressure on the probe with the same deliberate care she had learned watching her father at his bench. There was a resistance, then a give, then a sound, exactly like the sound she had heard in the garage on the night she had found the false floor in the tool chest drawer, the same quality of compressed air releasing, of equilibrium adjusting. The panel shifted, just barely. A fraction of a millimeter, but enough to see it, enough to feel the change in the way the floor held her weight beside it. Clara sat back on her heels. The workshop was completely quiet around her. Through the high windows, the gray morning light lay across the workbench in flat, even bars. The lamp above the main bench was off. Her father's books stood in their accustomed disorder on the shelves. Everything was exactly as it had always been. She looked at the shifted panel and thought of the diagram she had spread on her kitchen table 3 nights ago. She thought of the second floor plan drawn over the first, the one that showed a space below this floor that was larger than anything above it. She thought of the measurements along its walls and the notations she had spent 2 evenings reading and rereading until she understood them. She thought of her father's letter, of the words she had read and then folded and kept, of the quality he had named in her and the task he had, and in his characteristically quiet way, left for her to complete. She thought of everything her father had gathered over a lifetime, stones he had turned over in his fingers, objects he had described to her with the vocabulary of someone who had learned to see what others looked past. Clarity and cut, inclusion and facet. The way light behaved differently inside a stone, depending on what it was and where it had come from, and how long the conditions that created it had been in place. The panel was open a fraction. Below it was something she had not yet seen. Clara placed her hands against its edge and considered, for one more moment, the full weight of before and after. Then she began to lift. The panel was heavier than she had expected. Not dramatically so, but with the specific, considered weight of something built to last, rather than to be moved frequently. Clara felt the resistance in her shoulders as she lifted the edge, the concrete facing of the panel giving way to reveal a clean steel underside, its surface dull and unmarked by rust, protected by conditions that had clearly been maintained with care. She eased the panel back against the secondary workbench, where it rested at an angle, stable enough to hold without support. The opening it left was rectangular, roughly the dimensions she had measured from the diagram. The morning light from the workshop windows did not reach far into it. What she could see from above was a steel-railed ladder descending into a space that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, the kind of darkness that comes not from emptiness, but from enclosure. She had brought a flashlight. She had brought it because the diagram had told her to expect a descent, and she had prepared accordingly. She was also wearing rubber-soled work boots, rather than the shoes she had arrived in on her first visit to retrieve the chest. The preparation had been made without ceremony, the way she made most preparations, because the work required it, and not because she was dramatizing the occasion. She tested the first rung of the ladder before committing weight to it. The steel was cold through her gloves and entirely unyielding. The bolts anchoring it to the shaft wall were thick and set deep, exactly as her father's diagram had indicated. She descended rung by rung, her flashlight in one hand, the other gripping the rail, her eyes adjusting as the light from above narrowed to a rectangle behind her. The shaft was not long. 8 rungs, approximately 12 feet, enough to clear the foundation of the workshop above and place her in a layer of earth that had not been disturbed in years. When her boots reached the bottom, she stepped onto a surface that was not soil, but poured concrete, smooth and level, sealed with the same care she had seen in the panel above. She swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The space was larger than she had allowed herself to fully imagine from the diagram. Plans rendered on paper, even accurate ones, had a way of compressing dimensions into something the mind, scaled down to match the size of the paper, rather than the actual measurements recorded on it. Standing inside the reality of what the diagram had described was a different experience entirely. The ceiling was higher than she had expected, perhaps 7 feet at its center, declining slightly toward the far walls, where the earth above pressed down. The walls were lined with the same sealed concrete as the floor, their surfaces smooth and unmarked by the moisture or efflorescence that typically characterized underground structures of this age and depth. She counted her steps as she moved forward. 20 paces brought her to the first interior wall, a partition built of reinforced concrete block that divided the space into sections. A doorway opened in it without a door, its frame steel-edged, its dimensions wide enough to move equipment through. She went through it and found the first room. It was not large, perhaps 15 feet by 12. The walls here were lined not with concrete, but with wooden shelving. The timber darkened with age, but solid, its joints tight and its surface unwarped. The shelving occupied 3 of the 4 walls from floor to ceiling. What was on those shelves was organized with the same meticulous logic that had characterized everything her father arranged. At the top of each shelving section was a handwritten label, affixed in the precise notation style she recognized from his workshop notebooks. The labels were not dramatic. They were categorical. They named the contents of each section by type and, where relevant, by approximate date of acquisition. They were written in pencil on cardstock that had been laminated in a thin plastic sleeve, the kind of archival preservation measure she associated with her father's long habit of treating information as something worth protecting. Clara moved along the shelves slowly, reading each label, so allowing the information to arrive in sequence rather than rushing ahead of her understanding. The first section was labeled Sapphires, uncut and partially worked, various origins. Below the label, the shelves held a series of flat trays, each tray divided into individual compartments lined with dark velvet. In each compartment was a stone. The stones varied in size from specimens no larger than a thumbnail to one that occupied a full corner compartment and sat at a size that made Clara's throat constrict unexpectedly. Their color ranged across the sapphire spectrum in a way that told a story of deliberate collection rather than random accumulation. Cornflower blue, pale and luminous, deep royal blue, so saturated it absorbed the flashlight rather than reflecting it cleanly. A pad paradsha, peach pink, its color the specific delicate balance between orange and rose that made the variety among the rarest and most sought in the gem world. Her father had shown her a pad paradsha once, a small faceted stone, and had spoken about it for 10 minutes in a tone she had never heard him use about anything else. The second section was labeled Emeralds, Colombia, and Zambia. The trays here were deeper, the compartments slightly larger, and the stones they held were wrapped in individual cloth pouches that had been numbered by hand. Clara opened one pouch without fully removing its contents, tilting it enough to let the stone inside catch the flashlight at an angle. The green that came back was the deep, warm green of Colombian emeralds, a color that existed at a frequency that seemed somehow more alive than the colors around it, the kind of green that made the surrounding air look different by comparison. She closed the pouch carefully and returned it to its compartment and stood for a moment without moving. The number on the pouch was 47. The section held at least 60 pouches, arranged in rows across 4 shelves. She did not open another. She did not need to. She understood enough to know that what she was looking at was not a hobbyist's accumulation. The third section was labeled Rubies, Burma and Sri Lanka, with a secondary note in smaller writing that read, "See documentation in archive room." The trays here held fewer stones than the sapphire section, but each stone was larger, and several were accompanied by individual folded cards that Clara recognized as the informal grading notes her father had kept throughout his professional life on handwritten assessments of clarity, color, inclusion, and provenance that he had compiled as a matter of personal record rather than formal certification. She picked up one of the folded cards. The handwriting was his, as familiar as his voice. He had written a description of a ruby approximately 8 millimeters in diameter. Burmese, pigeon blood color with minimal inclusions, acquired from a specific contact, whose name he had abbreviated in the way he abbreviated names when he was being careful. Below the description, he had written a single number. She looked at that number for several seconds. Then she set the card back down. She moved through the remaining sections with the same methodical attention, reading each label before examining the contents, giving herself the time to register each category before moving to the next. Alexandrite, color change. Spinel, various. Tourmalines organized by type. Paraiba, rubellite, chrome. Savorite garnets in a section whose shelving was slightly newer than the surrounding wood, suggesting a later addition to the arrangement. Opals, wrapped individually, each pouch labeled with the country of origin and the approximate percentage of play of color. And then, on the far wall of the room, a section whose label was different from the others. Not a gemological category, just a date range, 1987 to 2019. The shelves beneath this label held not trays, but flat boxes, the kind used for document storage, acid-free and archival, stacked in clean rows. Each box was labeled on its end, with a year and a brief description. Acquisition records, correspondence, certificates, provenance documentation. Clara pressed 2 fingers against the end of the nearest box and held them there for a moment, feeling the slight give of the cardboard. Her father had been keeping records, not casually, not incidentally, but with the systematic dedication of someone who understood that documentation was the difference between ownership and assertion. Every stone she had seen in this room had a paper history, carefully maintained, filed by year, preserved in conditions specifically designed to prevent the deterioration that would render the documentation useless. She left the first room and continued through the space. A second room opened beyond another steel-framed doorway, smaller than the first, its purpose immediately distinct. This was a workspace, recognizable as such by the quality and arrangement of its contents. A heavy table occupied the center, its surface cushioned with a work mat of the kind used when handling fragile objects. Above it hung an examination lamp, its housing dust-covered, but its lens clean, suggesting it had been cleaned at some point more recently than everything else in the room. On the table, a loupe and a refractometer were laid side by side on a folded cloth, positioned with the habitual care of someone who returned to them regularly. On the shelf beside the table, color grading stones in their standard plastic housing, tweezers of several gauges, a digital scale accurate to hundredths of a carat, and a polariscope whose stage was still clean of residue. He had worked down here. That was what the room told her. Not just stored things, but came here and worked, examining acquisitions, making assessments, while maintaining the records she had seen filed by year in the archive boxes. She stood in the middle of the room and tried to hold that understanding steadily, to give it the space it warranted, without letting it collapse into something smaller than it was. Her father had spent decades building something beneath his workshop, and had done so in complete silence. He had come down this ladder, under this concrete ceiling, and had sat at this table with the same patience and attention he had applied to everything she had watched him do above ground. The work had been continuous, the documentation systematic, the care absolute. She thought of all the Sunday mornings she had sat on the stool at the secondary workbench while he worked at the main bench above. She thought of the stones he had turned over in his fingers, the ones he had shown her, the vocabulary he had pressed into her memory with the gentle repetition of someone planting something they intended to return to. She wondered how many of those stones had later come down these rungs, How many of the objects she had watched him handle in the workshop above were in the trays she had just walked past? She thought of his letter. I wanted to tell you. I kept thinking there would be more time. She did not allow herself to remain in that thought for long. There was more to see, and she needed to see it clearly. The third room was the smallest of the three. Its access was through a solid steel door rather than an open frame. The door unlocked but heavy, its hinges well-oiled so it moved without resistance. Inside was what she would later describe to herself as the core of everything. Not the most spectacular in terms of volume, but the most deliberate in terms of meaning. The room held a single flat surface, a table similar to the one in the workspace, but cleared of equipment. On it, arranged in a grid pattern that was immediately recognizable as intentional, were 12 individual display cases, each roughly the size of a book, each sealed with a small magnetic clasp of the kind used in archival display applications. Each case was lined with deep blue velvet, and in each, a single stone was mounted on a velvet post in the manner of museum display. Clara set her flashlight on the table and produced the second light she had brought, a focused examination light that she clipped to the table edge and angled to illuminate the nearest case without causing glare. She looked at the first stone for a long time before she opened the case. It was a ruby. Large. And she estimated the weight in her mind using the visual proportions her father had taught her, checking that estimate against the dimensions of the cushion cut, trying to be conservative rather than generous with her reading. The color was a red so pure and saturated that the examination light passing through it produced a glow on the velvet beneath the case that seemed to belong to the stone rather than to the light. The inclusion structure, visible at her angle of view, was characteristic of Burma. The silk was there, the fine needle-like inclusions that were not flaws in a Burmese ruby, but rather the indicators of natural origin that distinguished it from synthetic or treated material. She had learned that distinction at approximately age 9, sitting on a stool, pressing a loop against her eye at her father's direction, or a folded card was tucked against the velvet wall of the case. She did not open the case to retrieve it. She had seen enough of her father's notation style in the first room to understand that the card would contain the stone's recorded history, its acquisition, its prior certification status, and his personal assessment. She would read it, but not yet. She moved to the second case, a sapphire, cashmere, the color so distinctive that she recognized its origin before she had fully focused on the stone's body. Cashmere sapphires had a quality of color that gemologists described with words like velvety and sleepy, terms that sounded vague until you looked at the actual phenomenon and understood exactly why those words had been chosen. The blue of a cashmere sapphire was not a surface blue. It was a blue that existed inside the stone, so it distributed through it like a light source rather than a reflected wavelength. She had seen photographs of cashmere sapphires. She had never seen one in person. She stood at that case for longer than she had stood at the first. By the time she had moved through all 12 cases, an hour had passed that she had not tracked. The stones represented a range of varieties and origins that, taken individually, would have been remarkable. Taken together, they constituted something that she didn't have a word for, except that the word significant was not sufficient. An alexandrite whose color change was so complete and so dramatic that even in the limited light of the examination lamp, the shift from green to red as she tilted the case altered the character of the entire room. 2 spinels, Burmese, in the red tone that had historically been confused with ruby and had its own fierce, extraordinary personality, distinct from everything around it. A Colombian emerald in the 12th case that was the largest faceted emerald she had ever seen outside of a photograph or a museum catalog. She stood in the small room for a long time after she had made her way through all 12 cases. The weight of what she was standing in front of was not a weight she could convert to numbers in that moment. She did not try. She was not qualified to convert it to numbers, and even if she had been, the stillness of the room and the quality of the silence and the specific quality of the light on 12 stones that her father had gathered over a lifetime and preserved here with patient and perfect deliberateness were not things that should be rushed into arithmetic. She thought of her father turning a stone over in his fingers, the habitual gesture of a man who understood objects by handling them, by the way they responded to light and to the pressure of a knowing hand. She thought of what he had said in his letter. He had said she had always understood what it meant to look at something until you actually saw it. And she had sat in the workshop of a man who had been building this, accumulating this, documenting and preserving this with the full consistency of a life's intention. And she had never seen it. Not because she had not been attentive, but because her father had been more careful than she had understood. He had built the layers of concealment so thoroughly, so naturally, so much in keeping with the ordinary textures of his life above ground, that even someone watching closely would have seen only a man in a workshop turning a stone over in his fingers. She gathered herself and returned through the rooms in sequence, back through the workspace, back through the first storage room with its labeled shelves and archived documents, back to the base of the shaft. She climbed the ladder slowly, emerging into the workshop with the particular disorientation of someone returning from a place whose scale has recalibrated their sense of the ordinary. The workshop looked the same as it always had. The lamp was off. The shelves held her father's books. The workbench was scarred in patterns she had known since childhood. But something had shifted, not in the room, but in the way she occupied it. The concrete floor beneath her feet was not what it had appeared to be for her entire life, and knowing that changed the geometry of the space in a way that had nothing to do with the physical structure and everything to do with what the mind did with revelation once received. She replaced the rubber matting over the panel and stood the secondary bench back in its position. She left the workshop the way she had found it and locked the door. She drove home. She did not call her siblings. She did not call anyone. She sat in her kitchen with the notebook open in front of her and a cup of tea she had made on instinct and then not touched. And she wrote down everything she had seen, in sequence, in the most accurate language she had available. She wrote the room dimensions as best she could estimate them. She wrote the section labels from the storage room in the order she had encountered them. She wrote the 12 stone categories in the sequence of the display cases, with her estimated weights and her notes on color and origin. She wrote carefully and completely, because documentation was its own form of protection, and her father had understood that too. When she finished, she read back what she had written. Then she made a cup of tea she actually drank, and thought for a long time about what needed to happen next. The answer had been taking shape since she had read the diagram at her kitchen table 3 nights ago, and it had clarified further with every step she had taken since. She needed an independent gemological appraisal, not an estimate, not an informal assessment, but a formal, documented appraisal conducted by a certified expert in a way that would produce an authoritative record of what existed below her father's workshop. She needed this for reasons she could articulate precisely, because her siblings would challenge whatever she reported without documentation, because the legal implications of an estate of this nature required professional valuation, and because her own knowledge, however informed by years of her father's teaching, was not the kind of knowledge that held authority in rooms where authority was being contested. She knew who to call. Her father had spoken of several independent appraisers over the years, upon the kind of practitioners he respected, people whose reputations rested on accuracy rather than on telling clients what they wanted to hear. He had mentioned one in particular, a woman named Renata, who operated from a studio in the city, and whose certificates were recognized by the major auction houses. He had spoken of her with the specific regard he reserved for professionals whose standards matched his own, which was the closest he came to unqualified endorsement. It took Clara 2 days to locate Renata's contact information, 1 day to compose a message that communicated enough without communicating more than was prudent, and 1 more day to receive a reply that confirmed an appointment for the following week. In the interim, she managed the ordinary business of her life: work, groceries, the small tasks that constituted the infrastructure of daily existence. She spoke to her brother once, briefly, about the estate timeline. She spoke to her sister not at all. Neither raised the subject of the workshop or its contents, which told her they had no reason yet to look beyond what they had already assessed and dismissed. She told no one about the space beneath the floor. Renata arrived on a Thursday morning. She was a compact, direct woman in her mid-50s, whose manner conveyed the particular authority of someone who had spent 3 decades being right about things that mattered. She drove herself, arrived precisely at the time they had agreed, and accepted the cup of coffee Clara offered without ceremony, before asking the question that most needed to be asked. "What are we looking at?" Clara had thought carefully about how to answer that question. She said as accurately as she could, "My father was a serious private collector. He built a secure storage space below his workshop. I've made an initial inventory, but I'm not qualified to provide a professional assessment, and I need a formal appraisal before I can take any other steps." Renata had studied her over the rim of the coffee cup with an expression that was not skepticism exactly, but professional reserve, the measured attention of someone who had learned not to calibrate her expectations from a client's description before seeing the material itself. She asked several practical questions about the structure, the access, the storage conditions. Clara answered each one directly. Then Renata put down her cup and said, "All right, let's have a look." The descent into the space was practical for Renata, in the same way it had been practical for Clara. She moved down the ladder with the ease of someone accustomed to examining material in unconventional settings, which, Clara had learned over the years, was true of anyone who did serious gem work. The field demanded adaptability. Clara watched Renata's face as she entered the first room and switched on her own examination light. She had not expected drama, and she did not see it. What she saw was something more interesting. The slight tightening of concentration, the shift in Renata's posture from neutral professional attention to the specific, focused stillness that preceded serious work. Renata moved along the shelves methodically, opening trays, examining stones under her loupe, spending varying lengths of time with each section according to what the material warranted. She did not speak for the first 40 minutes. When she did speak, it was to ask a question about the archive boxes. She wanted to know if the documentation was complete for all sections. Clara said she believed so, based on what she had seen, and that her father had been systematic throughout his professional life. Renata nodded once, the gesture of someone filing information rather than responding to it. They moved through the workspace. Renata examined the instruments on the table with a brief, professional attention and made a comment about the maintenance of the equipment that Clara took as a form of respect. Then they moved to the third room. Clara watched from the doorway as Renata worked through the 12 display cases. Here the silences were longer. Here the quality of Renata's attention was different, not more concentrated, because she had been entirely concentrated throughout, but different in its nature, the way that attention to an exceptional thing differs from attention to a good thing, even when the focus is equally sharp. Renata opened the case, holding the cashmere sapphire, and lifted the stone with tweezers, holding it to her examination light at multiple angles, for longer than she had held any stone she had examined in the first room. She returned it to its mount and held her loupe over it a second time, which was a repetition she had not made elsewhere. She opened the alexandrite case and said, without looking up from the stone, "How long did your father collect?" Clara said, "from before I was born." Renata nodded slowly, the stone still under her loupe. She said, without drama, "He knew what he was doing." That was the entirety of her commentary until they returned to the surface. In the workshop, under the ordinary light of morning coming through the high windows, Renata sat on the stool beside the secondary workbench and drank the second cup of coffee Clara had brought in a thermos. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing a significant amount of information before speaking. She said, "I need to work through the archive documentation before I can give you certified numbers. I need to spend a day with the material properly, with proper lighting and my full kit. What I can tell you today is my initial impression, which is a professional impression based on 30 years in this field." She paused. "What your father built here is not a private collection in the way that phrase is usually meant. It's a portfolio, assembled with real expertise, documented with real rigor, and stored in conditions that have preserved the material at an extremely high level. The range of what he accumulated is extraordinary. The specific material in the third room represents the kind of acquisition that most collectors spend entire careers attempting and rarely achieving. I've seen private collections before. I've assessed a number of significant ones. I haven't seen anything assembled at this level outside of institutional contexts." Clara asked the question she had been holding since the first evening she had spread the diagram on her kitchen table. Renata looked at her. She said she would not give a number without completing the full assessment and consulting the provenance documentation, because numbers given without that rigor were not numbers Clara could use. But she said, "The answer to the question you're actually asking is yes. What your father built here is something that will change the practical circumstances of your life completely and permanently." She paused again. "The material in this room alone," she gestured toward the workshop floor, "represents a figure that I would characterize as extraordinary by any standard I can apply." Clara asked what range she expected the full assessment to produce. Renata picked up her coffee and considered. She said that based on current market conditions for the specific material she had examined, and pending verification of the provenance documents, she would expect the formal appraisal to return a total value in the range of $250 to $300 million. She said those numbers were subject to revision pending documentation review. She said she was not given to estimating generously without cause, and that her initial impression of the archive's completeness suggested the documentation would support rather than reduce the figure. She looked at Clara steadily as she said it, in the manner of someone delivering information rather than producing an effect. Clara sat on the second stool. She did not speak immediately. The number Renata had named was not one she had prepared for, despite the fact that she had been preparing carefully for several weeks. There was a difference, she found, between anticipating the possibility of a significant discovery and hearing a specific figure stated in a specific room by a specific professional whose reputation rested on accuracy. The room around her felt the same. The workshop smelled the same. The morning light coming through the high windows was the same light it had always been. The world had not rearranged itself to accommodate the information. It simply held it, alongside everything else. She thought of her father at his workbench. She thought of the Sunday mornings, the vocabulary he had pressed into her, the patience he had modeled and she had absorbed. She thought of a man who had spent decades doing something extraordinary and had done it in full silence, below the floor of an ordinary workshop in a modest house at the edge of a small town, but while his family moved through the rooms above and never thought to look down. She thought of David's laugh. Of course, he had said. She was welcome to it. It was an old thing and probably not worth the effort of moving. She said to Renata, "How long will the full assessment take?" Renata said, "If I can have access to the space for 2 full days, and the archive documentation is as complete as I believe it to be, I can have a certified preliminary appraisal ready within 10 days of the second visit. Clara said, "When can you start?" Renata said, "Monday." They agreed on Monday. Clara walked Renata to her car and thanked her with the same plainness that Renata herself had modeled throughout the morning. When the car was gone from the drive, Clara stood for a moment in the yard outside the workshop. The oak trees were still and dark above the structure. The yard was quiet. A wind came through briefly and moved through the long grass at the fence line with a soft, unhurried sound. She did not go back inside. She had what she needed from the morning, and she understood that the next phase required something different from her than exploration or discovery. It required patience of a kind she knew herself to be capable of. The same patience she had been practicing since before she could have named it as a discipline, rather than simply a quality she seemed to have been born with. She returned to her car and drove home and went to work. The 10 days that followed were unremarkable on their surface. Clara fulfilled her professional obligations with the habitual competence that had characterized her working life for years. She answered emails, attended meetings, completed the tasks required of her without variation from the patterns her colleagues expected. She ate dinner at her kitchen table. She slept, imperfectly but adequately. She did not call her siblings. She did not speak of the workshop or its contents to anyone. The days she was aware of most acutely were the 2 days Renata spent in the space below the workshop floor. Clara had given her the key to the property and access to the workshop, and had arranged to be absent so that the assessment could be conducted without the pressure of observation. On each of those evenings, she received a brief message from Renata confirming that the day had been productive and that the documentation was proving consistent with what she had hoped. Clara responded briefly and left it at that. On the 10th day, Renata arrived at Clara's apartment with a document folder and a manner that communicated the completion of something rather than its beginning. She sat at the kitchen table where Clara had spread her father's letters and the diagram on the night this had started, and she opened the folder and produced the preliminary appraisal report. It was 43 pages. The report was structured in sections corresponding to the storage rooms below. Each section opened with a general description of the material category, followed by individual entries for each stone assessed, each entry containing the stone's physical description, its grading results, its provenance summary as drawn from the archive documentation, and its assessed value range at current market. The entries were precise, technical, and written in the authoritative language of a field where precision was a professional obligation. The totals appeared at the end of each section, and then at the end of the report as a composite figure. Renata walked Clara through the major sections with the same focused calm she had brought to the underground rooms. She explained the basis for values she had applied, noted where provenance had strengthened or adjusted her initial estimate, identified the stones she considered exceptional within an already exceptional collection. The Kashmir sapphire had its own subsection. The alexandrite was noted as one of the finest examples she had personally assessed in her career. The ruby from the first display case was described, in a phrase that stopped Clara for a moment on the page, as museum caliber. The composite figure at the end of the report was $278 million. It was noted as a preliminary figure, subject to revision pending final certification by the relevant gemological authorities, and that the revision was more likely to be upward than downward, given the quality of documentation and the preservation state of the material. Renata explained this calmly, without inflation, as she would have explained any methodological note in any professional document. Clara looked at the number for a long time. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at things, steadily, without rushing the process of seeing, by moving past it before the full image had resolved. $278 million, assembled stone by stone over decades, documented with the patience of a man who trusted records more than declarations and built things to last rather than to impress. Preserved below the floor of a workshop at the edge of a small town. Hidden not maliciously, not fraudulently, but with the quiet intention of a person who had decided that what he built deserved to land in the right hands, and had taken the time to arrange for that. In the right hands. She thought of the letter folded in the notebook. She thought of the words he had written. She thought of everything he had not said directly, and had instead prepared, documented, arranged. The inheritance he had chosen to leave had not been assembled carelessly or accidentally. Every stone in every tray, in every room below that floor, had been chosen by a man who knew what he was looking at, and had looked steadily until he saw it fully. She thought of what her father had named in her, the quality of looking until you actually saw something. She closed the appraisal report carefully and looked across the table at Renata. "There are other parties who may claim an interest in this estate," she said. Renata nodded. She said that was not uncommon in situations of this nature, and that Clara would want legal counsel before taking any further steps. Clara said, "Yes." Renata said there was one more thing. Among the archive documents she had reviewed in the course of the assessment, she had found a sealed envelope attached to the inside cover of the final binder in the 2019 archive box, the most recent. It was labeled in the same handwriting as the display cases and the labels throughout the storage rooms. It was addressed to the person who completes the assessment. Renata produced it from the folder. It was not the same plain paper as the letter in the tool chest. This envelope was the same thick archival paper as the document boxes in the storage room. The paper her father had used for correspondence he intended to outlast the ordinary. It bore no additional marking beyond the address. Clara held it in both hands. She thought of every threshold she had crossed in the past 3 weeks. The drive to her father's house, the first evening in the garage, the night she had spread the diagram on her kitchen table, the descent into the workshop floor, the morning she had stood in the third room and looked at 12 stones arranged with the deliberate patience of a man's entire life. Each of those moments had had a before and an after, and she had entered each one steadily, because she had been raised by someone who understood that the most important things required you to be present when they arrived. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was longer than the first one. Her father had written it by hand, on 3 sheets of the same archival paper, the pages numbered in the top right corner in the small, precise numerals she recognized from his notebooks. The handwriting was the same steady hand she had known her entire life, though she thought she could detect in certain passages a slightly increased deliberateness, the careful formation of letters by someone who understood that these words would be read in his absence and wanted them to arrive intact. She read it through once without stopping. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the window for a moment, at the afternoon light on the glass, at the ordinary world outside going about its ordinary business. Then she picked the letter up again and read it more slowly, the way she had learned to read things that warranted the full investment of attention. Her father had written about the collection from the beginning. He described how it had started, not as an ambition, but as an extension of the work he had always done, handling stones, understanding their value, building relationships with people in the trade whose judgment he respected and who respected his. The first acquisitions had been modest, things he had set aside from transactions, pieces he had recognized as worth more than their context suggested, objects that had come to him because he was the kind of person who looked carefully, and the people around him knew it. He had stored them carefully. He had documented them. He had continued. He wrote about the decision to build the space below the workshop. He had made that decision in his mid-50s, he said, after a period of reflection about what would happen to what he had accumulated if something happened to him and the collection had no proper home. He had thought about declaring it, about transferring it into a formal structure, about speaking openly to his family about what he had built. He had considered each of these paths seriously and had rejected each one in turn, and he explained why with the plainness that characterized everything he wrote. He had watched his children grow into adults, he said. He had watched them make choices and form values and respond to the world with the particular characters that were theirs, and he had loved all three of them in ways that were not diminished by what he had observed. But he had observed nonetheless. He had watched the way each of them oriented toward the things he valued most: the patience, the attentiveness, the willingness to look at something without immediately calculating what it could be converted into, and he had reached conclusions that he considered honest rather than cruel. David and Margot were not bad people, he wrote. He wanted that clearly understood. They had their own strengths, their own lives, their own legitimate claims on his love, but they didn't see the collection the way he saw it. When they looked at stones, they saw assets. When they looked at his workshop, they saw inventory. That was not a failing, exactly. It was simply a different way of being in the world. But it was not the way he had spent his life trying to live, and it was not the way he hoped the things he had built would be handled. Clara had been different, he wrote, from the time she was old enough to sit on a stool and ask questions. She had asked questions not to hurry toward answers, but because she genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. She had sat with uncertainty without being made anxious by it. She had held a loupe to her eye at 8 years old and waited, with a patience he had found almost startling in a child, for the image inside a stone to resolve out of blur into clarity. And he had watched her do that and had thought, in the unhurried way he thought about things that mattered, that is the quality. That is what is required. He had built the space below the workshop over 2 years, he wrote, doing the work himself in sections, at night and on early mornings, in a way that explained certain absences and late returns that he doubted his family had ever questioned, because he had always been someone who kept his own hours and his own counsel. He had moved the collection below the floor gradually, over the years following the construction, until what was stored above was a functional workshop, and what was stored below was everything he had accumulated and wanted protected. He had maintained it throughout. He had continued to work down there, as Clara had seen. He had continued to add to the documentation and, for in the final years, to the collection itself, because the work had never felt finished to him, which was true of most work that mattered. He had written the tool chest letter 2 years before he died, when his health had first begun to trouble him in ways he recognized as more than temporary. He had thought about how to leave the entry point to the collection somewhere that Clara would encounter it, and his other children would not. The tool chest had been the obvious choice, he wrote, and he allowed himself a brief, dry observation about the fact that he had been keeping secrets inside it his entire professional life, and it had never once been searched. He wrote about the formal letter he had prepared with his solicitor, separately from this one, establishing the distribution of his estate. The house and its contents, as listed in the formal estate inventory, would be divided according to the standard arrangements his family expected. The collection and the space below the workshop were not listed in that inventory. He had taken legal counsel on this point and had been advised, carefully and thoroughly, on the implications. The collection had been accumulated through his own labor and independent resources, documented in his own records, stored in a structure he had built on land he owned outright. His solicitor had prepared the relevant documentation, establishing that the space below the workshop and its contents constituted a separate, designated bequest, and that the designation was to Clara by name, on the condition that she locate and access the space through the information left in the tool chest, and demonstrating the quality of attention he had always believed she possessed and that the collection deserved. He wrote, "I know this is not straightforward. I know it will cause difficulty. I want you to understand that I have not done this carelessly, or without thinking about what it will cost you in terms of what you will have to face from David and Margot. I have thought about it carefully and have done what I can legally to protect your position. The rest will require you to stand firm, which I believe you are capable of, and which I believe is better preparation for the weight of this than anything I could do to remove the difficulty in advance. He wrote, "The collection is worth protecting, not because of what it converts to in financial terms, though those terms are significant, and Renata, if you have found her, Fong will have given you accurate numbers. It is worth protecting because of what it represents, which is the possibility of looking at the world carefully and finding, in that careful looking, things that other people walk past. I have spent my entire life believing that the capacity for real attention was the most undervalued thing in the world. I built what I built because I believed it, and I leave it to you because you are the person I know who has it." At the end of the letter, after the practical instructions for next steps, the solicitor's name and contact details, the reference number for the legal documentation, the name of the gemological authority he recommended for final certification. He had written a final paragraph in the slightly different hand of someone coming to the end of something long held. And he wrote, "I am sorry I didn't tell you in person. Every time I considered it, I felt the conversation we would have had to have around it, the things that would have had to be addressed about your brother and your sister, and the choices I had made about how to distribute things. I did not want those conversations to happen while I was alive to see them. I think that was cowardly of me, and I acknowledge it. What I hope is that by the time you are reading this, you will also understand it. We do not always say the things we mean in the time we have to say them. We leave things in envelopes and in spaces below floors and in the hands of people we trust. That is also a way of saying them." Clara folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Renata had the quiet courtesy to say nothing, for the afternoon light moved through the kitchen window and across the table between them, and the house was completely still. After a while, Clara said, "He named a solicitor." Renata nodded. Clara said, "I'll call them tomorrow." Renata picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and set it down again. She said, "Whatever happens in the next weeks and months, your position is well supported. The documentation below that floor is as thorough as any I've seen." He was careful. She paused. He was very careful. Clara said, "Yes." That was all either of them said about it for the remainder of the afternoon. The solicitor was a measured, experienced woman named Harriet, who had handled her father's affairs for the better part of 2 decades, and who received Clara's call the following morning with a calmness that told Clara she had been expecting it, or not with urgency, but with the settled readiness of someone who had prepared something and was now waiting to see it used. The appointment took place 2 days later. Harriet's office held the particular atmosphere of a practice that prioritized substance over presentation, its surfaces organized, its shelves dense with bound volumes, its quality communicated in the attention to detail rather than in decoration. Harriet produced the relevant documentation from a file that had been prepared with the same care Clara had come to associate with her father's way of doing things, and laid out the legal position with a clarity that required no interpretation. The designated bequest was valid, fully prepared, and supported by documentation that Harriet had advised her father to compile over the course of the previous 3 years. The collection had been established as a separately designated asset through a supplementary provision in his estate arrangements, distinct from the standard estate inventory. The provision was conditional on the locating and accessing of the material by the named beneficiary, a condition that had now been met. The legal authority of the provision had been carefully reviewed, and Harriet was satisfied that it would withstand challenge. She did not use the phrase "withstand challenge" casually. She explained that the provision was designed to be robust, precisely because her father had anticipated that it would be challenged. She said this with a professional neutrality that contained within it a very complete understanding of the family dynamic it addressed. Clara asked how long the formal process would take. So Harriet said that the standard process, assuming no legal challenge was initiated, would take between 6 and 12 weeks. She said she expected a legal challenge to be initiated. Clara asked what she would need to do. Harriet said, "Be patient. Stay calm. Let me handle the legal process. And do not discuss the specifics of the collection or its value with your siblings until I advise you that it is appropriate to do so." Clara said she understood. She left the solicitor's office and drove to her father's house for the first time since the morning she had descended below the workshop floor. She parked at the edge of the property, on the grass as she always had, and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house. The garden along the front walk had continued its quiet growth in the weeks since his death, the wildflowers pressing further into the path with an unhurried confidence. The workshop stood behind the oak trees, its door closed, its presence unremarkable to anyone who did not know what lay beneath it. She got out of the car and walked to the workshop. She let herself in, stood in the familiar space, and did not go to the panel in the corner. She just stood in the room for a while, under the off-light and the morning coming through the high windows, in the particular atmosphere of a space that held more history than its surfaces suggested. She thought of all the mornings she had stood in this room as a child, and as an adult, and as a daughter, and had not known. She did not feel deceived. That was the thing she had been testing in herself since she had read the first letter, whether what she felt was something closer to betrayal, a sense that his silence had taken something from her. She had examined that possibility honestly, because she was the kind of person who examined possibilities honestly. And what she found was that she didn't feel it. What she felt was something more like the emotion that came with understanding a long piece of music only after hearing it in full, the retroactive meaning that arrived when the last note completed the pattern that had been building throughout. He had been teaching her something her entire life, and had arranged for the teaching to conclude only after he was no longer present to see it. That was the shape of it. It was not deception. It was preparation. She stood in the workshop for a few more minutes, and then she locked the door and went home. The challenge came, as Harriet had predicted, within 2 weeks. It arrived in the form of a letter from a firm retained by both David and Margot jointly, which itself told Clara something about the speed with which her siblings had coordinated once the possibility of an overlooked asset had been raised. The letter was formal, aggressive in the specific legal way that avoided explicit aggression while communicating it completely, and it made several claims that Harriet described, when Clara sent her a copy, as predictable and adequately addressed by the existing documentation. What it could not be described as was comfortable. Clara read it at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and felt the full weight of what her father had warned her it would cost. Not financially, not yet, but in the specific emotional register of a family conflict, to the recognition that the relationship between herself and her siblings, already strained by the ordinary tensions of decades of being related to people who were fundamentally differently oriented, had moved into a new territory from which there would be no complete return. She called David because she thought she should, because she was the kind of person who believed that direct communication was better than communication conducted entirely through intermediaries when that was still possible. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting her call. The conversation did not go well. That was not surprising. David had a particular way of framing things that made reasonableness sound like self-interest, and he applied it with full consistency throughout their exchange. And he spoke of fairness and equal treatment and the proper distribution of their father's legacy. He spoke of surprises and concealment as though these were things Clara had engineered rather than discovered. He was not overtly cruel. He was precise in the way that people are precise when they are making an argument they have rehearsed. Clara listened without interrupting. She said, when he finished, that she understood his position and that Harriet was the appropriate person to address it through, and that she hoped they would be able to come through the process without making it any harder than it needed to be. David said, "It didn't have to be this hard." Clara said, "No." She ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a while. She was not angry. She was something more complex than angry, but a blend of sadness and resolve that had her father's quality in it, the quality of a person who had looked at a situation clearly and then decided what needed to be done and done it without drama or excessive narration. She did not call Margot. She had considered it and decided that the conversation with David had been sufficient information about how both calls would go, and that Harriet's advice was sound. The legal process was exactly as Harriet had characterized it. It required patience. There were filings and responses and a period of discovery during which the documentation from below the workshop was formally presented, reviewed, and assessed by the relevant parties. Renata's preliminary appraisal was submitted as part of the process. The archive documentation her father had maintained for decades was made available to the opposing counsel under controlled conditions. The supplementary estate provision was examined, challenged on several grounds, and each challenge was met by documentation that Harriet had prepared with the same thoroughness that her father had invested in the collection itself. Clara attended the necessary appointments, answered the necessary questions, and returned each evening to the ordinary routine of her life, which she maintained with a disciplined consistency. Work, meals, the small tasks that kept a life functional. She slept better than she had expected to. She thought that was because the waiting, difficult as it was at least a form of action, a process she had put in motion that was now moving under its own authority, and that the uncertainty she lived with was bounded uncertainty, the kind that had a foreseeable resolution rather than the open-ended uncertainty of not knowing what shape the future would take at all. She visited her father's house twice more during the legal process, each time entering the workshop and descending below to sit in the third room for an hour, not examining the stones in the display cases with any professional purpose, but simply being in the presence of them. She thought of it as keeping the collection company in the way you kept a garden during a difficult season, not because there was work to do, but because presence was its own form of maintenance. On the second of those visits, she brought her father's notebook from the kitchen drawer, the one that still held his handwriting on the first 3 pages. She sat at the work table in the second room, under the examination lamp, and read his notes again, with the time and attention she had not given them during the initial urgency of discovery. She understood them more fully now. What had appeared to be simple inventory notation was, read carefully, a record of decisions. What he had chosen to acquire, and why, and what he had assessed the object to represent beyond its monetary value. He had been writing, in the compressed language of professional notes, a kind of ongoing argument about value and attention and what made a thing worth preserving. She added her own notes at the back of the notebook, as she had been adding them since the beginning, because documentation was its own form of protection, and because it felt like the right way to continue something he had started. So the legal resolution came 11 weeks after Harriet had filed the initial response to the challenge. It came, as most legal resolutions came, not with drama, but with a notification, a call from Harriet on a Thursday afternoon, while Clara was at her desk at work, speaking in the measured, careful tone that communicated significance without allowing itself to be heard by anyone in the vicinity. The challenge had been unsuccessful. The supplementary provision stood. The collection and the space below the workshop were confirmed as Clara's by the terms of her father's estate arrangements, legally clear and properly executed. Harriet said there was a possibility of further challenge at a higher level, but that the grounds for such a challenge were substantially weakened by the current ruling, and that her assessment was that the opposing parties would be advised not to pursue it further. Clara said, "Thank you." Harriet said, "He prepared this very well." Clara said, "Yes, he did." She finished the workday, which was what she did, because there was work to finish, and the news she had received did not change that, and she was not the kind of person who made events of things before she had fully processed them in private. She drove home, made dinner, ate it at the kitchen table, and sat for a long time afterward in the quiet of the apartment. She thought about what came next. It was not a vague thought. She had been thinking about what came next since the first week of the legal process, when she had understood that the waiting was real, but that the outcome, given the quality of what Harriet had in hand, was probable rather than simply possible. She had been thinking carefully, in the way her father had always thought carefully, about what she would do with what she had been given. The answer had taken shape slowly, not in a single moment of decision, but through the same gradual accumulation of clarity that had characterized the entire arc of discovery. She knew several things with certainty. She knew she did not want to liquidate everything immediately. She knew she did not want to hold everything indefinitely either. She knew that the collection was more than a financial asset, that it was a record of a life and a way of seeing, and that what it deserved was stewardship of the same quality as what had produced it. She also knew her own situation with the plainness that came from having lived in it for 4 decades. The apartment she rented was adequate, and she had always made peace with adequate. The job she held was stable, and she had always been professionally reliable in ways that were respected without being noticed in any larger sense. She had no debt that was unmanageable, and no savings that were more than modest, and no circumstances that she had failed to accept, because she had learned from her father that acceptance was not the same as defeat, and that the life you built within your means had a quality that the life you borrowed against your future did not. She was not going to be changed by this into something she was not. That thought came to her clearly, and she held it with something that felt like relief. The change would be material, practical, real in the ways that practical changes were real. The constant underlying tension of money that was never quite enough would lift. The margin that her father had spoken of in his letter, the space to say no, the space to rest, would exist. That was significant. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything that she needed, and nothing that she did not. She called Harriet the following morning and told her she was ready to begin the formal process of transferring and managing the collection. Harriet gave her the name of a specialist solicitor who handled the legal aspects of major private collections, and told her that Renata had already been recommended as the independent appraiser for the final certification process. Clara wrote both names in the notebook. The final certification was completed 6 weeks later. For the official figure, adjusted upward from the preliminary appraisal based on additional provenance verification by the recommended gemological authority, was $278 million. The number arrived in print, on official documentation, bearing the certifying signature of an institution whose authority in the field was absolute. Clara read it in the way she had read everything through this entire process, steadily and without rushing the process of its settling. She filed it alongside the other documents in the folder Harriet had organized, behind her father's letter and the diagram and the smaller envelope that had said, "For the workshop," and the appraisal report and the legal ruling. She kept the folder at home, in a specific place, because documentation was its own form of protection, and she had learned that from a man who had understood it deeply enough to apply it over a lifetime. The news reached her siblings through their respective legal representatives, which was how it had been handled throughout, because Harriet had been correct that conducting things through intermediaries was appropriate, and Clara had followed that advice consistently. She did not know exactly when David and Margot received the final confirmation. She knew it had reached them by the end of that same week, because her phone rang with David's name on a Saturday morning, and she looked at the screen for 2 rings before answering. The conversation was different from the one they had had in the middle of the legal process. David was quiet in a way she had not heard from him before, a quietness that was not the composure of someone who was processing and would return to advocacy, but the quietness of someone who had come to the end of a position and found nothing behind it. He asked, without aggression, how she was. She said she was fine. He asked, after a pause that carried its full weight, whether there had been any indication, any sign that he had missed. Clara considered that question for a moment. She thought about what to give him and what to withhold, and decided, in the spirit of honesty, that her father had modeled in everything he wrote, to give him the truth. She said, "He taught me to look at things carefully. He did it from the time I was a child. I think that was the indication." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He knew you'd find it." Clara said, "Yes, I think he did." They did not speak for much longer. When she ended the call, she sat with the phone in her hand for a while, thinking about David not with triumph or vindication, but with the more complicated feeling of someone who understood both sides of a situation and found neither side simple. He was not a villain in this story. He was a man who had valued the wrong things and had missed the right ones, and who had spent 11 weeks in a legal challenge discovering that his miscalculation was permanent and consequential. That was not a small thing to carry. She did not wish it on him, even now. She did not hear from Margot directly. Margot communicated, when she communicated, through the language of absence, which Clara had learned to read over a lifetime of knowing her. The silence said everything it needed to say. What came after was quieter than Clara had expected, and she had expected it to be quiet, because she was not someone who went looking for noise. The transfer of the collection was handled with the same care that had characterized every stage of the process, Renata coordinating with the gemological authority, Harriet managing the legal mechanics, the appropriate insurance and security arrangements made through channels her father had already identified in his final letter. The process wasn't fast, because doing it correctly was more important than doing it quickly, and that was a principle Clara held without difficulty. She kept her job for a further 3 months, not out of financial necessity, but out of the recognition that departure from the patterns of her daily life required its own kind of preparation, and that the continuity of ordinary work during a period of significant change had been grounding rather than constraining. When she left, she did so without drama, thanking the colleagues who had been decent to her over the years, with genuine warmth, and leaving the office on an ordinary Friday afternoon. She kept the apartment for several more months as well, not because she could not change, but because she was choosing her changes deliberately, rather than exhausting herself by making them all at once. She was her father's daughter, in that regard, among others. The collection, following the completion of all formal processes, was placed in professional secure storage with arrangements for ongoing management and conservation that Renata had helped her establish. Clara visited it regularly, not every week, but often enough that it never felt abstract or distant, never became a number in a document, rather than the actual objects her father had chosen and preserved. She kept the loupe he had given her when she was 15 in a small case in her kitchen drawer, and sometimes in the evenings she would take it out and hold it without purpose, the way her father had held stones, for the feel of it in her hand and for whatever it connected her to. She did not speak publicly about what she had found. This was a decision she had made early and maintained with the same quiet consistency that had characterized the entire process. The privacy was not secrecy. It was the recognition that what had happened between herself and her father and the space below his workshop floor was a matter of private significance rather than public narrative, and that treating it as the latter would diminish it in ways she wasn't willing to allow. She had the solicitor formalize the records in the workshop, the documents and notebooks her father had kept above ground throughout his working life as a separate archive, properly housed and properly cared for. Not for any public purpose, because they were his, and they deserved the same quality of preservation he had applied to everything he valued. There was an afternoon, several months after the final certification had been received and the collection had been placed in its permanent home, when Clara drove out to her father's house for the last time before the property passed through the estate process into its next chapter. She parked on the grass at the edge of the drive as she always had. She walked through the garden along the front path, which had grown fully wild now in the way of gardens left to their own counsel. The wildflowers dense and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to any opinion about them. She let herself into the workshop with the key from the back step. She stood in the middle of the room in the afternoon light from the high windows and looked at all of it for a long time. The workbench, its surface scarred in patterns she had known since childhood. The shelves holding her father's books and notebooks. The lamp above the workbench that had been on in every memory she had of this room. The secondary workbench along the eastern wall. The rubber matting in the corner, still in its place. She did not lift the matting. The panel below it was sealed as she had left it, and everything that had been below it was now elsewhere, properly housed, properly documented, properly cared for. The space below the workshop floor was empty now, in the way that spaces were empty when the things that had lived in them had been transferred to where they were going. It was not an absence, it was a completion. She stood in the room for a long while and thought about her father, not with the specific grief that had been with her in the months immediately following his death, the grief that had its own texture and weight, and had not yet resolved itself into the quieter form it would eventually take. She thought of him with the particular quality of feeling that came when you understood someone fully, when the last piece of what a person was had arrived and the whole picture was visible, and you could hold it all at once without any remainder. He had been a man who looked at things carefully. He had looked at stones and seen inside them. He had looked at his children and seen clearly. He had built something extraordinary and kept it hidden, not out of secretiveness, but out of a very particular kind of love, the love that trusts someone enough to leave them the hardest part unsupported, because it believes they are capable of meeting it. She had met it. He had known she would. She thought of what he had written at the end of his last letter. We do not always say the things we mean in the time we have to say them. We leave things in envelopes and in spaces below floors and in the hands of people we trust. That is also a way of saying them. She understood now, fully, what he had been saying. Had been saying, in fact, from the first afternoon he had pressed a loop into a small girl's hand and guided it to her eye and told her to wait. Just wait until the image inside resolved out of blur. Had been saying in every Sunday morning in the workshop, in every stone turned over in his fingers, in every word of vocabulary pressed carefully into her memory. Had been saying in the years of silence about what lay below the floor and in the diagram and the letters and the sealed envelope addressed to whoever completes the assessment. All of it had been the same sentence. It had simply taken her father an entire lifetime to finish saying it. Clara turned off the workshop lamp, which she had turned on out of habit when she entered, and stood for a moment in the afternoon light from the windows alone. Then she slid the workshop door closed on its oiled track, the sound of it exactly as she had always known it, and walked back through the yard and out through the front garden and to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at the house. The garden was completely itself now. The wildflowers had moved all the way to the edge of the path and were beginning, with great unhurried patience, to cross it. She started the car and drove home. The fields on either side of the highway opened up and spread out in the late afternoon light, familiar and steady, the same landscape she had driven through her entire life. She drove without thinking about the route, because she knew every bend and every landmark. And the knowing was in her hands and her body rather than requiring active navigation, which left her mind free for other things. She thought about what she would do with the margin her father had left her, the space to rest, the space to say no, the space to think beyond immediate survival. She had been thinking about it since she read those words, and she had been thinking about it carefully, in the way she did everything worth doing. The answer was not finished yet. Some of the most important things were not finished for a long time. But she was not in a hurry. Hurry was something that belonged to people operating inside scarcity, and she had been operating inside scarcity long enough to know exactly what it cost and why its absence was not something to be wasted on haste. She would do what her father had done. She would look carefully. She would wait until the image resolved out of blur. She would act when she saw clearly, and not before. The road bent in the way it always bent, and the town appeared ahead in the way it always appeared, and the light on the familiar streets was the light of late afternoon in a place she had known her whole life, and would continue to know, because some things you did not need to leave in order to keep. She drove home. She made dinner. She ate at the kitchen table. She opened the notebook and wrote, in the space below her last entry, a few sentences that were not inventory or documentation or instruction, so they were simply an observation, the kind her father had made in the margins of his notebooks when something struck him as worth recording. That the most extraordinary things are often hidden in the most ordinary places. That this is not an accident. That the people who find them are usually the ones who have spent a long time learning how to look. She closed the notebook and left it on the table and went to bed. Outside, the evening settled over the town with the unremarkable consistency of evenings everywhere, the stars coming out one by one over a street where nothing particular was happening, where the houses stood in the dark, holding all the ordinary lives inside them, each one resting above whatever the ground beneath it had chosen, for now, to keep. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.